a nice thing to do, yeah.
Like, even like She Loves You, you know, like She Loves You, yeah, it's not that easy.
What would you give to have your favorite celebrity spill the beans and shed light on specific issues? In a lifetime of timeless pop music, nobody has been as influential as Paul McCartney, and nobody has done it as consistently as him. Despite his unparalleled success, fans and critics often wonder what is true and what is not, especially concerning his past. At 82, McCartney is willing to restate some of the rumors. How will this reveal change the image of the Paul McCartney we've held over the years? The Paul is dead conspiracy. Was it ever real? For over 60 years, the name Paul McCartney has been a dominant name in the music world. As a Beatle, he was part of the sound of a generation. However, there have always been rumors and conspiracy theories around the life and the career that he tried to build. Unfortunately, McCartney has been quiet over the years, and fans do not know what part of the truth is and which part of fiction is. This new reveal, however, has left every die fan. Did it mean the McCartney conspiracy was all true? Why did it take so long for him to come clean? It was a chill evening on November 9th, 1996. Paul McCartney just had a long day working on the Sgt. Pepper album and was driving home when a car crash took his life he was involved in. At least that was what everyone believed. When the news went around, everybody was shaken. On the other hand, the Beatles had quite a difficult decision to make. Would they reveal the truth to them, or hide the tragedy of his demise moving forward? This was the kind of mind-blowing news that made rounds back in the day. According to the conspiracy theorists, the Beatles settled for the latter option. Allegedly, they replaced Paul with someone like him. They rumored his name to be William Campbell, and even mentioned winning a Paul McCartney look-alike contest, a sign that he was good enough to fill Paul's shoes. The Beatles continued to make music throughout the years, and as the years rolled by, fans began to pick up weird clues and messages hidden within their songs and the artwork of their albums. Presumably, it felt like the remaining band members had not gotten over Paul's alleged demise, and they were trying to signal a secret message because they were overcome by their guilt of keeping Paul's demise a secret. Despite these claims, the story that Paul McCartney had crashed his car, which led to his early demise, was entirely untrue. There was no doubt that Paul had been involved in 2 minor car accidents at that time, but multiple witnesses, and Paul had proved that he was completely fine. So, where did this wild conspiracy theory come from? There was no evidence to support the claim of a lookalike and a person named William Campbell. In short, the rumor had no legs and seemed just a silly myth, until something happened. On September 17th, 1969, an article by Tim Harper was published in the student newspaper of Drake University, Iowa. The title of the article read, "Is Beatle Paul McCartney Dead?" This was the first Paul is dead theory that was published. Tim could not have known what lay in wait for him because that article became an international sensation. Soon enough, the idea of searching for clues around their album artwork started to make sense again, as some even claimed they had found hidden messages and symbols that proved his demise. As the article began to make headlines, a caller dropped it live on air on a Detroit radio station. DJ Russ Gibb found himself intrigued by the rumor, and the show quickly became an entertaining discussion about the rumor and the possible clues. The more days passed, the more other radio stations picked up the story. WABC's discussion of the rumor even made it to 38 states in New York. Finally, out of Paul McCartney's office, the rumor concerning his demise was broken to him over the phone. Paul's response was classic. He replied, "Oh, I don't agree with that. Is there more to this story? What clues did people get from their songs that made them believe I have indeed kicked the bucket after all? Despite the efforts to debunk these rumors, the claim has fascinated the Beatles fans over the years. Many of these clues or ideas were born out of imagination, while some were the work of those conspiracy theorists. The rumors were so much that John Lennon got fed up with fans overanalyzing the Beatles' song lyrics. So, in 1968, he penned Glass Onion to confuse and tease those who wanted to find the hidden messages in his lyrics. He was right after all. The Paul is dead conspiracy theorists took the bait and read the lyrics as a confession to Paul's demise. Fans went wild over the song, particularly the line that read, "Well, here's another clue for you all. The walrus was Paul." The Paul is dead conspiracy theory also emphasized the Abbey Road album cover. Fans scrutinized the image, finding issues with the barefoot odd gait morbid. This made quite a lot of sense because, in some cultures, the deceased are buried without shoes. So they proceeded to speculate that the cover depicted some kind of funeral procession. Proponents of the theory also point to John's white suit, George's denim, and Ringo's black attire as further evidence, because their outfits represented mourning, grave digging, and conventional funeral wear, respectively. However, when these supposed facts were scrutinized, it was found that in the photograph shoot, Paul was wearing sandals, which he is said to have taken off because of discomfort. As usual, the Beatles dressed similarly to the outfits that were in vogue at the time. John even refuted the claims that his white suit on the Abbey Road cover symbolized mourning or a religious suit. So, he rhetorically asked, did Humphrey Bogart wear a white religious suit? All I've got is a nice Humphrey Bogart suit. He added that it was just a stylish reference to the actor. The sheer number of fans fantasizing about hidden messages in Beatles songs has long existed. When looking at the supposed phrase, "I buried Paul" in the final section of Strawberry Fields Forever, a closer listen tells us that John said, "cranberry sauce" instead. Other fans have suggested they have found hidden messages when playing Beatles songs backward. For example, some people believe that the number 9 vocal loop on Revolution 9 contains a phrase like, "Turn me on, dead man." Others claim that the lyric, "Monsieur, Monsieur, Monsieur," how about another one? In "I Am So Tired" is "Paul is dead, man, miss him, to be mere coincidences, because sometimes our brains are wired to see patterns that can create an imagination to trick us. The hidden truth about the Beatles breakup. Over the years, Paul McCartney has been blamed for the crumbling of the Beatles band. An early 1970 press release, in which Paul announced his exit from the band, made him the villain of the group for good. However, Paul has finally set the record straight. So, what was the truth? Why did they break up after years of being together? The Beatles are among a few bands that have etched themselves like tire marks in our hearts from the humble beginnings of the Fab Four, that is, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr in Liverpool. They revolutionized music. Unfortunately, like so many other groups or bands, they pulled apart, and this was a result of so many underlying factors that happened just behind the scenes. Everything started with the loss of their manager, Brian Epstein, in 1967. Brian was the quiet guardian behind the success of the Beatles. He had quite a different approach to managing the band, which made it possible to manage their conflicts moderately. His involvement with the band was crucial, especially during their chaotic touring phase. But when the Beatles stopped touring in 1966, the influence he had vanished. However, amid all this, Epstein remained steady, and managed their interpersonal relationships and financial decisions. Epstein launched Apple Corps, a tax shelter scheme for the Beatles record label, in 1967. Everything seemed to be fine until a tragedy occurred just 1 year later, on August 27, 1967, when Epstein overdosed on substances. Subsequently, the effect of his demise bore disastrous consequences. Inexperienced in business matters, the Beatles fought to manage the Apple Corps, but it turned out to be a chaotic, stressful experience. The Beatles lost their balance after Epstein passed away, making the band members afraid of what their future would hold because there was no trusted hand to lead them. Navigating the music industry alone wasn't easy at all. With nobody standing up to fill the void left behind, Paul McCartney decided to fill in and started handling projects. However, his bandmates began to resent his growing dominance over the musical and business aspects of the band's affairs. In the end, it would all come down to John Lennon, later recalling how McCartney's efforts for the band's survival weren't just out of pure loyalty to the band, but also a response to his fear of his career as a soloist. However, McCartney believed that the band had come down with a curse when they became businessmen instead of musicians. Without Epstein there to keep matters in order, the Beatles were unprepared for the financial and managerial demands that came with their success. But that's just the tip of the iceberg for the Beatles' battle. During the second half of the Beatles' career, George Harrison changed. He became a gifted composer. Yet John Lennon and Paul McCartney rejected some of his ideas for songs, resulting in tension between them, mostly around 1968 onwards. Harrison felt underappreciated, ignored, and unseen because of Lennon and McCartney's dominance. His frustration became even more profound because the competition for space on album sides had increased, with 3 songwriters vying for attention. Later, he recalled that at the time, he was happy to contribute occasionally as a composer, but he felt stifled because Lennon and McCartney refused to listen to his songs. Plus, he thought his song ideas were a lot better than theirs. This alienation slowly grew inside him, and Harrison soon started to feel disconnected from the band. Harrison became the first Beatle to release a solo album with Wonderwall music in 1968. He began to explore his creativity away from the Beatles. After all, we don't always know what we are capable of until we face the situation. In the same year, the Beatles were getting ready to gather at George Harrison's home in Esher to record demos for their upcoming album. As the band tried to come up with songs for the album, the tension between them was growing, and at the album's release, you could notice the difference in styles and interests. Rolling Stone would later describe the album as 4 solo albums under one roof. Then there was Yoko Ono, Lennon's new girlfriend. She influenced Lennon, and it began to make the other band members feel like outsiders. Their usual working schedule now involved much of Ono's presence in the studio, which was not the norm. Specifically, Harrison felt a chill because he had previously bonded with Lennon through a shared experience with LSD and Indian spirituality. For the record, it was not forbidden for the band members' friends to show up occasionally to see how things were done. However, in the case of Ono and Lennon, it became an everyday thing. It was unacceptable, as it made band members uncomfortable. What would happen if everyone started bringing their girlfriends or wives to rehearsal? Anyway, the Beatles carried on with the White Album, as the cracks in the band became even more visible. When the band released their album in 1968, those cracks became apparent holes. Unfortunately, it extended to their public appearances. These appearances and interviews became individual-based instead of as a group. This disunity also stretched to their 1968 Christmas fan club recording. Unlike their previous collaborative efforts, each band member recorded individually for the first time. The air was as thick as cotton, and John Lennon's remarks about his bandmates hating Yoko Ono did not help. At the start of 1969, Apple Corps found itself in shambles. The company was amid mismanagement and financial losses. To get a grasp of their business affairs, John Lennon and Yoko Ono met with Alan Klein, an experienced music executive. Klein impressed Lennon with his expertise, and eventually he asked him to represent his interests in the band. Meanwhile, Paul McCartney had his plans. At the time, his girlfriend, Linda Eastman, was an American entertainment lawyer's daughter, so he decided to work with them. Not only did McCartney marry Linda on March 12th, but their union strengthened his ties with the Eastman family. Unfortunately, this union did not entirely yield the desired result. In April, the Eastmans, Klein, and the Beatles came together for a meeting, but it was a total failure as finding a consensus became increasingly difficult among the band members. The same month, Klein was brought in as the band's intern, business manager, and the Eastmans as attorneys. However, this decision became a major contributor to the band's dissolution. The untold feud between Paul McCartney and John Lennon. While all these were happening, Paul McCartney and John Lennon were not entirely best friends, especially after the Beatles split for people who were close friends when their band was still together. The climax of their friendship was quite surprising. After the Beatles split, Paul McCartney revealed his complicated relationship with John Lennon and his efforts at reconnecting with Lennon in the 1997 biography, Paul McCartney, Many Years From Now, by Barry Miles. Unfortunately, his efforts were met with rejection. Lennon would call him and suggest getting together, but he would reply, "Yeah, what do you want, man?" These responses ended up leaving McCartney anxious. The feud between John Lennon and Paul McCartney was no secret. Lennon did not keep it under wraps, openly criticized McCartney in interviews, and even wrote songs that were a direct jab at his former partner, like How Do You Sleep? However, McCartney also reveals that the feeling was mutual. He remembered a particularly bitter phone call with Lennon, who had somehow adopted an American accent. At the end of the call, it rubbed off on McCartney. Although the relationship between Lennon and Paul was very heated, they could set their differences aside and become civil again. McCartney looked back at the times when Lennon would break the tough exterior he seemed to put out. One of these moments was when, in the heat of their argument, Lennon suddenly pulled his glasses under his nose, looked over the top, and said, "It's only me." As soon as he said that, he put his glasses back in place, and the moment was over. Paul McCartney also talked about how he and John Lennon had their friendship back on track after the Beatles broke up in his 2021 memoir. The two barely spoke to each other for some time, but when they came to terms with the fact that life went on without the Beatles, they started reaching out to each other. However, their conversations over the phone were usually tense or full of insults, but they always talked about business. Eventually, they settled their differences. When McCartney was in New York, he would call Lennon and invite him for a cup of tea. When John Lennon's life was cut short, the tension between him and Paul McCartney settled. McCartney was grateful because their reconciliation had allowed him to cherish memories of their last years together. This reconciliation was important to McCartney, who reflected on it in his memoir. If Lennon had been unalived during their spat, he could have been destroyed by guilt and regret. Instead, their last meeting was warm and friendly, where the two former bandmates talked about making bread. On the morning of John Lennon's demise, Paul McCartney spoke to reporters outside his Sussex home. Paul mentioned that he was too sad to talk about John, but he recounted him as a fantastic man who made incredible music and art. He wanted peace, and the whole world will miss him, he said. However, when asked about John's death later that day, Paul looked less sad. He ended his response to their question with, "Drag, isn't it?" and then walked away. With that, many assumed that Paul was not sad enough. He later explained that he did not mean to sound that way because he was still shocked and sad and did not know what to say. 2 years later, when reflecting on that particular situation, Paul still found it challenging to find the words to describe this feeling. "I felt everything," he said. "I was crazy, scared, and angry. It felt like the whole world was ending. I still cannot believe it happened." Many fans were overcome with grief after the demise of John Lennon. Sadly, at least 3 fans were so devastated that they took their own lives. This tragic news deeply moved Yoko Ono, John's wife. She decided to get in touch with the fans and give them hope. On January 18, 1981, she wrote a letter titled "Ingratitude," which was published in the New York Times and the Washington Post. Yoko thanked the millions of people mourning John in her letter. In addition, she asked them to honor John's memory and urge fans to look for healthy ways to help themselves deal with their grief. However, the shocking part of this story is that the feud between Paul McCartney and John Lennon wasn't the only Beatles-related secret Paul had been holding on to. The truth about his feud with George Harrison. In May 2001, it was revealed that George had to go to the hospital to have an operation to remove a cancerous growth in one of his lungs. In July, he was being treated for a brain tumor at a clinic in Switzerland. Fellow Beatle friend Ringo Starr visited George during his treatment, but Ringo had to leave suddenly to be with his daughter, who was having emergency brain surgery in Boston. George's sense of humor was impeccable, and he asked Ringo if he wanted him to tag along. In November 2002, George started radiotherapy at Staten Island University Hospital in New York City because the lung cancer had spread to his brain. However, he was distraught with his doctor when the news of his private medical information was made public. Sadly, George had passed away just a few weeks later. Although George and Paul had quite a rift as bandmates for the Beatles over songwriting and who knew how to write best, his last days with George were one of a kind. He shared a memory of his previous meeting with George Harrison. Paul remembered they had sat down together, holding hands for 4 hours. This display of affection between 2 pals from Liverpool was rare, but it was just a simple act. They looked at each other as Paul recalled thinking, "This is not what 2 Liverpool fellas do." He even thought George would shake his hands, but George didn't pull away. Rather, he held on to Paul's hand and stroked his thumb gently. They talked about George's treatment together, how he had been moved from clinic to clinic, and on one occasion he asked, "Can't we just stop in one place?" At that moment, Paul decided to playfully suggest they go to Speke Hall, an old Tudor tourist spot in their hometown of Liverpool. "That would be great," George smiled and said. "It was a long friendship. He was almost like my baby brother because I had known him that long," he reflected. In another interview, Paul was happy he had met George. "I knew George before all the others, and I loved that man. I am so proud to have known him." Regardless of the sorrow that came with saying goodbye, Paul wanted to remain with happy memories. You take the great bit, which was that last time you saw him, and that's what you remember. That and all the other lovely memories. But Paul's confessions didn't stop there, because when it comes to love, loss, and regrets, there was one person he couldn't forget. The love story that almost never happened. When Paul McCartney met Linda, everything changed. Most of Paul McCartney's love songs beginning with My Love and Maybe I'm Amazed, were inspired by his relationship with Linda McCartney. Only a year after the meeting, Paul asked Linda to marry him, but their love story nearly went downhill hours before the wedding day. Paul confesses that the night before their wedding, the couple was close to breaking up and almost cancelling the entire ceremony. In an interview with Ultimate Classic Rock, Paul recalled they had a significant argument. Despite their rocky start, the couple got married and went on to live 29 years together. Paul McCartney's 29-year marriage to Linda is an extraordinary journey he doesn't keep quiet about. We were right in the middle of that white water, man, so it's even more miraculous that we made it, he said. On March 12, 1969, the couple exchanged their vows at the Marylebone Registry Office in London. Although the couple had tried to keep the ceremony a private affair, the crowds were so thick that police eventually had to rescue the couple's car from being crushed by the crowd. Their marriage wasn't exactly picture-perfect, especially after the Beatles broke up. Paul McCartney found himself in a very dark place as he was struggling to get through the loss of the end of the band. Fortunately, Linda was with him. Paul said her love and support helped him to pull himself from the darkness that almost drowned him. In an interview with Apple Music, he mentioned that Linda had been a part of his life. He admitted that he did not know what would have happened if he hadn't had her support when battling to come to terms with the Beatles being gone. Despite the near-perfect marriage people saw in the media, Paul explained in a 1985 interview that they had their fights, yet they loved each other deeply and sincerely. They had 4 children and lived on their Scottish farm. Their passion for vegetarianism had to be spread, and they worked hard to spread it. Together, they created a successful food company, advocating for vegetarianism while breaking barriers with prejudices to the movement. Barry Miles described the McCartney family as the most loving family ever. Unfortunately, in 1995, Linda was diagnosed with breast cancer. Watching Linda's health decline was one of the hardest things for Paul. Despite going through extensive treatment, the disease took her life at the age of 56. Among the list of things Paul has confessed to, another rumor haunts him even more. What Paul regrets the most. For someone who has lived the life most people only dream of, Paul McCartney has regrets that he would give his right hand to shake off. Was it something he said, someone he let go, or was it something darker? When Paul McCartney composed Yesterday at age 24, he did not initially know that the song had anything to do with his own true life stories. Later on, he revealed that the song was probably inspired by the demise of his mother, Mary McCartney, who passed on 10 years earlier. Paul McCartney's mother kicked the bucket after a breast cancer operation when Paul was 14. Her demise was a result of an embolism. The emotions he felt during his youth can still be felt in the lyrics of Yesterday. I'm not half the man I used to be. And why she had to go, I don't know. She wouldn't say, take on more weight when it is viewed as words that came as a result of McCartney's loss. Again, throughout his career, Paul McCartney had to deal with several substance-related incidents that led to his arrest, deportation, and visa denial. The US government repeatedly denied visas to McCartney based on his substance use convictions until December 1973. In 1975, he was arrested for a second time in Los Angeles for possession of illegal substances. His wife took the plea deal then, so the charges were dismissed. One notable incident recorded in January 1980 was when McCartney was arrested in Tokyo, Japan, after customs officials found approximately 8 ounces of substances in his luggage. He was held for 10 days and deported without charge. Years later, when Paul reflected on the incident, he was shocked at what possessed him to stick this bloody great bag of grass in his suitcase. Due to possession of that substance, Paul McCartney had several encounters with law enforcement. During a 1984 holiday in Barbados, he was arrested and fined the sum of $200. After the incident, McCartney expressed his opinion concerning the substance. He claimed it was much less harmful than other illegal substances. He said he had done no harm to anyone and should be punished more leniently. Yet, in 2015, McCartney revealed he had given up using illegal substances, explaining he wanted to prove a good point to his grandchildren. Paul McCartney's music has had quite an effect on the world. It is one of the songs that resonates with the audience today. Among these songs are Yesterday and Hey Jude. For Yesterday, over 2,200 recorded versions were made, and according to BBC, it has been played on American TV and radio stations several times. Following this record, it has reached the most played song by a British writer in the all-time list. His 1968 songs achieved the highest sales in the UK that year and topped the US charts for 9 weeks, which is longer than any other Beatles single. There is no denying that Paul McCartney was quite a force with his music. He may have made mistakes, but will those mistakes forever define him? What do you think of Paul McCartney's revelation? What part of it have you always known? Kindly share your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel.